Here's a guy who doesn't think his pee-pee evolved.
What good is 1/8 of a PP? It's no good.
Just because that's your experience doesn't mean that it's universally true.
Like, you gotta have the PP and the testicles?
Testicles evolved first. You don't need a pee-pee in order to fertilize some eggs. Many fish, for example, have testicles, but no pee-pee, and the sperm just comes out the cloaca.
Right? So what good is 1/8 of a PP? Because there would be millions of years where the process of the PP comes to be PP, right?
That's right.
One of the major selection pressures that caused the evolution of the pee-pee is that for land animals, intercourse is a more reliable way of fertilization than laying eggs onto the ground and depositing sperm onto the eggs, like fish do. Everything gets all dried out when you do that on land, so it's more advantageous to inseminate the eggs before they're laid. At the early stages of this process, even a tiny protrusion is more advantageous than a flat hole.
What good is 1/8 of a vagina? No good. Pointless.
Wow.
Wow, indeed, Professor Dave. I figure Jay's trying to make the irreducible complexity argument, but he's not even picking one of the more compelling examples. 1/8 of a pee-pee sounds like it's just a really small pee-pee, which would still be more of an evolutionary advantage than no pee-pee at all. I don't know why this is so hard for Jay and Jim Bob to see. Usually arguments from irreducible complexity point out cases where a simpler version of some physiological feature can't perform its function at all, although what they miss is that they can perform other functions instead. 1/8 of a pee-pee would not be completely devoid of function.
Scientism, physics type people, Neil deGrasse Tyson, right? They don't care about philosophy, and they actually discourage people from looking into it or studying it precisely because philosophy asks the questions that are difficult for them. They don't know how to answer or how to grapple with those things because philosophy is, as our friend who called in a minute ago pointed out, it's a more abstracted discipline historically. And it's more difficult for these guys to deal with. You would think that since they have an interest in mathematics, that they would be able to do more abstract thinking, but they can't. It's really weird. And so there's something that shuts off in a lot of these people's minds, I think, to where they're unable to conceptualize perhaps the domain of metaphysics or the domain of even epistemology.
I think most of the time they don't want to engage with people who confuse sophistry with philosophy.
And I would bet money that Professor Dave doesn't know basic fallacies, doesn't know basic epistemic argumentation and the principles of justification either. And I can say that because I've dealt with these types so many times and for so many years, all the way back to 1999, 2000. Was when I first started dealing with these types of professors, that it's really the best route because you can't escape logic in epistemic questions, reasoning. And it's funny because these people think that they have cornered the market on logic and reasoning. But when you start to ask one level up abstracted questions like, what is logic? What is reason? Where is it? How is it?
Logic is the set of rules that distinguish between statements and inferences that we seem to be able to make sense of and ones we can't seem to make sense of. For example, I believe in the law of non-contradiction because I can't make sense of contradictions. As for where logic is, well, it's in your brain. The phenomena they describe are things the brain does. They're not woo-woo Platonic forms that are inherent to the universe, if that's what you think they are.
These people are done. Let's see what he says in regard to an old interview that I did with Jim Bob.
Jay Dyer with cartoonist, maybe, I don't know. Yeah, I think I've heard that name before, but I don't know who that is. All right, so we're gonna, let's watch this one. Damn it.
Yeah, Darwinism, he could have been right about, a beak getting bigger, but
Right.
I've looked into more of that, and all that shit is going down.
It is.
Fast. Because they still haven't accounted for the fact that there's digital information embedded in us, and
No. It's not digital information. It's just a sequence of nucleobases. That's it.
How does Professor Dave know that the information encoded in us is just a sequence of whatever?
I don't agree with Dave in this instance because information is simply non-randomness. The sequence of nucleotides in our DNA are not random. They mutate randomly, but those mutations are filtered by natural selection non-randomly. Apologists, however, think that non-randomness is proof of intelligent design. It's not. And they like to call the information in DNA digital information, even though it's not digital, because that makes it sound less like a natural phenomenon.
How does he know that it's not actually meaningful information?
I think it is meaningful information, but what I mean by meaningful is that genes correspond to proteins. The meaning of each gene is the protein it creates when it's fed through a ribosome. I think Jay has a different understanding of the word meaningful.
So I think he doesn't understand that the sort of smug, snickering, dismissing actual meaningful information, or telos, purpose.
I guess he's using the term meaningful information to mean information that has a consciously imposed purpose. Genes often have very specific consequences, but the fact that they have consequences is not a good reason to infer that they were made by a consciousness for the purpose of causing that consequence.
Even in I think Jim Bob was talking about DNA. That was an interview we did maybe 5 or 6 years ago, but I think Jim Bob's talking about DNA. But to snicker and sort of dismiss this with this just sort of, well, we all know that it's meaningless information.
What reason do we have to believe that the information has a purpose?
Argumentation is about philosophy. It's not about peer-reviewed studies and who has more evidences. And I can pile up 55 peer-reviewed studies for my point.
Is there anyone who's not a creationist who uses the word evidences? And journals published by the Discovery Institute don't count as peer-reviewed.
That's what normies think is intelligence. That's what dum-dums, that's what the ladies on whatever podcast like Not So Erudite think is smart, right? Piling up peer-reviewed papers that you get from ChatGPT, right?
I didn't realize the legitimacy of a paper had something to do with what search engine you use to find it. With ChatGPT, you have to check that the paper is real and that it really says what ChatGPT says it says, but the mere fact that a paper can be found by ChatGPT has nothing to do with its veracity.
Information, I forgot the quote, is something like information habitually is related to a conscious mind.
Exactly.
Like there's no point in all of existence so far where information wasn't created by a mind.
Correct.
Yeah.
Incorrect. Information is just non-randomness. Any pattern that is formed by something else is information. This is the case even if the thing forming the pattern is not a mind. Tree rings are information about how many winters the tree has lived through. No mind is involved in forming them. Craters are information about an impact from an object from space. They even carry information about the size, speed, and trajectory of the object. No mind is involved in creating that. DNA is information about the selection pressures imposed upon an organism's ancestors. No mind is involved in creating that.
Yeah, except for all of the times when, yes, it fucking was, because what you're referring to as information is just a sequence of bases. That's it. You have monomers that polymerize, and that's it. That's all there is to it.
It's not just a sequence of bases, it's a sequence of bases that has been molded by natural selection. Since this is a non-random process, the sequence of bases does count as information. If the sequence of bases were in a random order, that would not be information. But because the order has been shaped by several generations of selection pressures, it is not random.
So it just is what it is. That's not even a response. This is so low tier. I actually thought this guy might bring a little bit of response, a little bit of attempting to deal with what the actual argument is. What the argument is comes from information science, right? It's an argument that Dr. Jason Lisle talks about with the fact that anytime there's information that is meaningful information, it comes from a mind.
I think you're begging the question. Earlier you said that meaningful information is information with a telos or a purpose. If that's the case, then saying that meaningful information always comes from a mind is a meaningless tautology. What reason do we have to believe that the information in DNA was created for a purpose? The DNA sequence has very specific consequences, but the mere fact that it has specific consequences doesn't indicate that it was consciously created for the purpose of causing those consequences.
At least as far as we know. Now that's in the domain of information science and computer science. And so Jim Bob is extrapolating from that, which is an argument that I made for a long time because it was in some of the Jason Lisle presuppositional argumentation books and lectures. Jim Bob is just kind of repeating what we talked about for a long time. And this guy's saying, no, it is what it is. Oh, really? So let's presup Dr. Dave here, because if information isn't meaningful, it's just what it is, then Dr. Dave's arguments aren't meaningful. And his words on his live stream are not meaningful and have no purpose or telos. So therefore, his whole response is meaningless.
Or some information is meaningful in the sense that it's created with a conscious purpose in mind, and some information is not meaningful in that sense. Tree rings are information that are a consequence of how trees grow differently in the winter than they do in the summer, allowing you to see how many winter and summer cycles the tree has lived through. That's not meaningful information in the sense that it was created by a mind to serve some purpose. But the sentences that Dave is speaking are composed with a purpose and therefore are meaningful in that sense. Some information is created with a purpose and some information is created by non-conscious events.
Endless
On his own grounds.
obsession with information and a code that comes from the mind of the blah, blah, blah. It's just a complete fucking non-starter. It's
Okay, so no arguments, just saying that to believe that information is meaningful or comes from a mind is a fucking non-starter. That's all he said.
Well, you can't assume that information comes from a mind. There are many forms of information that form with no discernible mind involved. Asking someone to prove that there's no mind involved is asking them to prove a negative.
Is this guy is like the pinnacle, 4 million subscribers of YouTube atheism these days?
just a desperate mischaracterization of molecular biology, right?
Yeah, but the argument isn't about molecular biology. It's about information science.
Honestly, neither Jay nor Dave seem to understand what information is.
And he's extrapolating that to all of life. It's a universal metaphysical argument about telos and purpose and meaningful information. It's not Jim Bob primarily trying to argue about biology.
We have no reason to believe that all information has a telos. What's the telos of tree rings?
To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.